Hello again, everybody. This is Raging Mandrill here. I just got back from the Shieldings event around about Memphis, and I can see on social media everybody's feeling energized, and Skeptical Waves has come out with Alan de Benoit's on being a pagan, which I asked for, and have been asking him to put that out for the last year or so. Um, I also noticed that my Substack articles are lagging behind in how quickly I'm putting them up on YouTube. I'm very much in arrears on that front. So I'm just figured in the spirit of intellectual inquiry and the timing for uh, Skeptical Waves putting out de Benoit's work that I would upload a voice recording to my YouTube account of my original Substack article that was put out a while ago. So this is a reply to Dave the Distributist by myself, Raging Mandrill, originally published on September 10th, 2022. And I apologize if this is going to be a little bit more freeform. I'm not going to just simply read all of it as it is on Substack. I'll add my thoughts and give a little bit more of my refined takes as we go along. Please do not send this to him. He is well aware of this. We've had discussions offline on this issue. So please do not bombard him with requests for comment or send him this article. He is well aware of this. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get into the actual article. I'd like to address many of the things said in Dave the Distributist mentioned in his recent Substack article from a week ago on the pagan-Christian debate. First, it's not a debate, it's a discussion. I hate the idea of debates as it ultimately just evolves into point scoring, which is why I won't ever be caught dead on Jay Dyer's channel. I don't really expect to convert a true believer of another tradition anyways, but I was inspired to write this defense, and so here goes. And of course, as I've mentioned previously in other places, for some reason I seem to have been the reply guy for this. I was very surprised that some of the other more serious people in the pagan circles who've been around longer, like Mike from Imperium Press or Tom Rousel of Survive the Jive fame, didn't choose to reply to this. So, people ask for my reply, so that's why I was the one who had to reply, because people apparently wanted my take on it. So point one, modern Christianity is responsible for leftism and the continuing destruction of Europe. To halt the decline, we need to abandon Christianity and return to the religion of our indigenous forefathers. So this is the 5 or 6 points that Dave makes, and he responds to them. So he addresses this point by making an analogy regarding mechanical parts breaking down and having to replace. I very much enjoyed this analogy. And his questions about why the part broke in the first place are good, but irrelevant at this point, and they are all based upon maintenance of the current system. I'll just say that from my view, the original parts aren't being made to the same quality or simply aren't being manufactured at all anymore. The obvious solution to bad parts, unavailable parts, is to find a new manufacturer, or, if no new manufacturer can be found, then to purchase a new vehicle which serves the same role as the broken one, but comes in a slightly different form. Traditionally minded Christians attempt to solve this problem by finding a new manufacturer for the part. In other words, Orthodox, Latin Mass Catholics, etc. And pagans choose to buy a new car. It may not be a sedan, but a truck will still get you from point A to point B despite exceedingly high gas prices. The obvious problem with getting a new manufacturer is that the part might still have a variety of problems. You might have a bad fit due to incorrect specifications, etc. Purchasing a new vehicle does come with significant upfront costs, but changing over any system has costs. The real question is, how long will the repair take to be completed? Does cost of repair and time it will take exceed the cost of simply buying a new vehicle? If repair is attempted, then a weld on a part might become a future structural weak point if performed incompetently. Repeated over time, that part would be at risk for catastrophic failure. Obviously, repair has its limits. This analogy of mechanical parts probably has an interesting sidebar for religion as a form of social technology. And when I first wrote this article, the Christians who initially read it, and it was getting passed around in some places, seemed to misunderstand the point. They do not perceive of religion as a social technology, whereas I have a tendency to do that. Everything is structural. So, and the mechanical analogy, despite Dave making the original mechanical comparison, seemed to have gone over a lot of the heads of quite a few people, which is something that I find interesting. So continuing on, the real underlying issue that modern pagans have between Christians is that pagans are influenced by Nietzsche, so is Evola, as well as de Benoit, notably. So yes, they do assert that Christianity is based ultimately upon slave morality. Christians refuse to accept this, so we are at an impasse. I think, however, that there is a fairly clear trend of Christianity being mostly incompatible with the practice of slavery, and that is likely due to the story of the Hebrew exodus from Egypt. You cannot teach the lumpen prole underclass that they can escape from bondage and give them an example proving and glorifying that it can be done. That will give them ideas, and you don't want to give the slave caste ideas. However, if pagans are correct, here is what I think will happen. Due to a combination of slave morality and lack of infant mortality thanks to scientific advancement, the spiteful mutant population increases in total numbers and percentage of the population. Then, once it reaches critical mass, it engages in truckish behavior to destabilize order and is led by the disgruntled members of the middle class who have ambitions of being the ones in power. Spiteful mutant behavior gets tamped down, and true orderly hierarchy eventually reasserts itself. However, such occurrences basically become perennial over time and reassert themselves in different times and places within that civilization until systemic civilizational collapse. Now, it is absolutely true that many pagan-affiliated people in the dissident right hold political positions on issues such as abortion and eugenics that Christians cannot be reconciled with. I think that paganism is a sort of spiritual Nazgul vortex, or at least is the right-wing way of spiritually getting to the end of the horseshoe. I believe that all religious rituals serve a real purpose which have real-world effects, even if their practitioners cannot precisely explain why, or even what those effects are. I think that that is a reason why the old ways, in other words, the pagan ways, engaged in human and animal sacrifice as well as permitted infant abandonment. I think it was a way of periodically culling the slave caste, thus keeping the slave caste from getting too big and destabilizing society. The periodicity of ritual sacrifice in the North Society was once every 9 years. I am now speaking of the rite which took place at Uppsala, which was written about by Adam of Bremen or Saxo Grammaticus, who of course were both Christian, depending on whose version you prefer. Or conversely by Ibn Fadlan writing about burial customs in terms of princely burials, for which slaves were ritually sacrificed by the Norse in Rus during ship funerals. Animal sacrifice is certainly well documented as part of the Indo-European religion. I'll answer more on the possibility for ritual recovery and what I personally believe later in the defense of paganism in later core criticisms. I'm going to step over all of that temporarily and highlight that 9-year periodicity, which I find fascinating. Why that time frame? It's the sacred number, of course, but there has to be more to it than just that. Of course, ritual actions which prevent violentous revolt might only work in societies with much lower population densities. So even if it was a defense mechanism, it might not work now because of the problem of scale. To conclude this section, I will assert the most right-wing criticism that I can think of. Yes, you can make a legitimate claim that progressivism, and by extension Protestantism, were heresies. But they were heresies that occurred under your leadership and your preferred system, and which ultimately the Church was unable to contain. This happens on your watch, therefore it is clear where the responsibility lies. What is the Christian response to dealing with bioleninism? Why does bio-Leninism continuously happen in societies in the West? If Protestantism is a bio-Leninist heresy, then could Cromwell be a bio-Stalinist figure like Napoleon? In other words, a generalissimo figure who rises through the ranks, like Napoleon, like Stalin as a generalissimo, who ceases leftward movement. If so, then what is the periodicity for bio-Leninist upwellings? Why that periodicity? What factors determine that periodicity? These are questions that we must answer. Given my narrative on the fall of Rome, would this not imply that this was in fact the true spirit of the Abrahamic religions, and specifically Christianity in the West? Here I'm going to quote Dave the Distributist. I suppose if the thing in question, here Christianity, was brand new and corresponds immediately with the failure of a previously working system, then you would have an intuitive case for its defectiveness. I reply, I will address this quote very briefly since it stuck out to me. This is indeed how pagans tend to view the rise of Christianity during the Roman Empire. I view the rise of Christianity as utilizing an inherently bio-Leninist strategy of women and slaves to acquire power in the early stages of its growth. Thus, you could say that it waged a Gramscian war of position and institutional capture on the pagan ruling structure of ancient Rome. From my view, this is a problem, since obviously the early church was indeed able to tamp down on those elements and establish some sort of order, but no longer. I agree that Protestantism has a lot to answer for on that score, but we've talked about that almost ad nauseum in our circles. The Roman Empire did not fall until after Christianity was made the official religion. Of course, that's official state adoption. There was a much longer process than Dave listed for the spread of Christianity within the Roman Empire and Europe in general. Scandinavia was not officially converted until the late 900s in Denmark and the mid-1000s in the other Nordic countries. The Baltic countries persisted much longer into the Middle Ages, with Prussia being converted in the 1200s, and Lithuania finally being officially converted in 1387. That's a significant point against Dave's narrative. We in the West typically think of the Middle Ages as entirely Christian, but the historical reality is much more complex, and an official pagan state lasting well into the high Middle Ages definitely is jarring. Of course, even after official state adoption, there will still be significant, possibly even a majority of people in a society who persist in the old belief system for quite some time. But yes, after official adoption, it is essentially only a matter of time before the new belief system becomes 100% normalized. There will also be a significant minority of people long after official conversion and majoritarian normalization of any new belief system who will persist in the old practices even if they don't fully understand the spiritual underpinnings of why certain rituals existed in the first place. So, the claim to 1700 to 2000 years of unbroken Christian control over all Europe is just simply historically inaccurate. You can make a case for Faustian civilization being a shining example of technological prowess, but Rome too was technologically advanced for its time before the collapse of that civilization. So that argument is just nonsense, and I mean the argument that, oh, all technological progress happens under a Christian rubric. As to the record of Christianity as a civilization driving force, yes, it obviously did create our current civilization. But now that the component of Christianity has deteriorated, what next? You either repair the part, replace it with a new component, or get a new vehicle. We would do well to remember that with all systems, either mechanical or spiritual, the cost of maintenance eventually exceeds the cost of purchasing a new. Core pagan criticisms 2 and 3. Number 2. Christianity seeks to enslave European man with the shackles of the past. Christianity binds man to the will of long-dead prophets and a dead God. Paganism is the true path towards realizing that every individual is a Nietzschean Uberman. We need paganism to recognize the brave, radical gods which live within all of us. Number 3. Christianity is a radically revolutionary religion. It proclaims that the past is evil. It spreads radical individualism. Paganism is the path back towards the true traditionalism and collectivism. We need paganism to constrain the anti-traditional will of the individual, which Christianity set free. Dave rightly complains that these two criticisms come together. I'm a geopolitical realist, so the reason why these complaints go together is that any up-and-coming religion or moral or social change will typically utilize rather disruptive, revolutionary methods to achieve its goals if it does not utilize a strategy of outright conquest. I've already sketched out my views regarding the Christian accession to power in the Roman Empire, so I won't belabor the point. Suffice to say, once the new system is in power, it will act more conservatively. This is why I'm very loath to accept the victimhood narrative when it comes from pagans. We can learn lessons from the current Middle East, especially in regards to oppression and religious intolerance. Generally, the larger a dominant group becomes in society, the more institutions it controls, and the smaller the non-dominant group in society is, determines the severity of persecution. Furthermore, it will also be more likely to engage in other unfair or unjust actions, such as procedural manipulations, the closer it gets to official power. So, when society is close to a 50-50 split, the average person is going to have lots of contact, possibly even friends and family who are part of the declining moral system, as well as the inverse of that, which is any person who still maintains faith to the old order is going to have family and friends who adhere to the new order. Furthermore, I didn't mention this in my original article, but left-wing pagans seem to adopt paganism for the reasons that it is perceived by them as a victim group, and so it is yet again part of the collecting of intersectional identities so as to advance up the intersectional hierarchy. This is especially true with white progressives and white liberals. Continuing on with the article. Now, our friends at Imperium Press wrote an excellent Substack article which helped to explain the pagan view in this, as the true difference in politics is between Odinic and Tyric sensibilities. First, a bit of Norse mythology. Both Odin and Tyr are gods of war, but they have different responsibilities in the Nordic pantheon. Odin is the king of the gods, and reigns in Valhalla, the home of the Aesir. He sacrificed his eye, or hung himself from a tree, depending on the version of the story, to gain knowledge and wisdom at the well of Mimir. He is the decider of battles, and his Valkyries take up the valiant dead to Valhalla. Tyr is the god of wisdom and justice. He sacrificed his hand to placate the wolf Fenrir, so that the dangerous creature could be bound in chains until Ragnarok, the ending of the world. Fenrir breaking free of his fetters is noted as a sign of the coming of Ragnarok. What is the meaning of this story? What moral value could we take from it? Well, Tyr maintains order and his domain is injustice, i.e. the law. Odin is the Allfather. He maintains control over the transition between life and death, which is obviously the most sensitive area of life. So you could say that this is a distinction between the laws between humans and the natural law, that the authority of all written laws ultimately are derived from force. Tyr is a conservative in this context in that he represents maintenance of the status quo. He sacrifices something valuable to restore order and keep the monster at bay, but the monster eventually breaks loose. So such sacrifice was only temporary, an ultimately ineffectual solution. This is obviously a rearguard action. In this way, you could describe one of the differences between pagans and Christians. Christianity, in the modern sense, is Tyric, in that it focuses on restoring order and bottles up the monsters that we fight today, so that they will break free and become more vengefully destructive. I think we can all agree that we are not yet in the position to be lawgiver. Odin, on the other hand, is a transitional figure. He does not represent lawful order, he represents necessary change. Regarding ancestor worship, I believe that our ancestors would rather see us doing well than to be destroyed. He's like, I do not worship my ancestors, I worship the Nordic pantheon. And yes, I would rather be an ethno-narcissist and have my civilization survive. I would willingly pay the moral and civilizational costs for that position than decline. I would rather be able to stand proudly, boldly facing the sun with the inner strength necessary to defeat our enemies, rather than have to look downward in humility before being able to make any movement for self-defense. I myself find that I have the odd habit of being too humble and indecisive for my own good. Core pagan criticism number 4. Christianity is the destroyer of European culture. They ravaged indigenous European civilization. Christians leveled pagan technological achievement. They consigned beauty of individual European cultures to a brutal sameness. This is again an opinion which I don't share, and hopefully I addressed it to satisfaction in the above paragraphs. Christianity, especially of the Catholic variety, after normalization did synthesize with the native heathen religion in a variety of ways, especially aesthetically. I personally do not wish to destroy the great cathedrals of Europe, which I had a chance to visit in my youth. Anyway, I think that the question of European spiritual unity is an interesting one. Tacitus referred to the Germanic god Tyr as Mars in Germania. So recognizable to him was that deity. There was no one unified religion, true, but there were common symbological, ritual, and story elements present in the pre-Christian religions of Europe. In my view, despite those different peoples calling the gods different names or assigning slightly different roles in the pantheons, they were worshipping the same gods which had been passed down to them from prehistory. What would this mean? It would mean that, in fact, there was a kind of spiritual, symbological, and of course, a following ethical connection among European peoples before the presence of the Christian Church. As to those symbological, attitudinal, and story elements, Dave is correct that many of them still reside in high fantasy and horror. To you, these things may seem small or irrelevant, but we do see them as residual elements that many Christians perform, but when pressed, simply cannot explain why they do certain things or hold certain attitudes or practices which have no presence in the Bible. One example which springs to mind is the example that de Benoit gives of Kierkegaard going to pray at a grove of oak trees. This is quite literally a very pagan thing to do. Oak trees were considered sacred places by both Germanic and Celtic traditions throughout history. Even the most cursory glance that survived the Jives channel would disabuse one of the lack of evidence of the obvious parallels and connections between the old ways, European folklore, Beowulf, and the Arthurian legends. Tolkien drew heavily from the Nordic sagas, and serious Tolkien fans do understand this. Even a Vosh tier Wikipedia article on the old European religions would have told you so. Nothing is hidden from you. Our gods do not fear the sunlight. They are the sunlight. Ostara is the goddess of the dawn. Diaus Piter, Jupiter if you prefer, is the sky god. Gandalf, being a wanderer who wears a grey cloak and a broad-brimmed hat, carrying a staff, known by many names, is quite literally how Odin appears in the sagas. Our stories of the gods came to us from time immemorial, before even the first word was written. This proves how lindy they are, since their stories have lasted the test of time and have persisted even whilst being preserved by those who do not worship them. Their timelessness proves their transcendence. Therefore, since they have lasted in a variety of forms, conditions, and environments, they are more fundamental to our being and our spirit than Christ. Simply, we wish for that fundament to be allowed to flourish and to be the priority of a spiritually separate community. Therefore, in the bifurcated, bipolar, spiritual nature of the West, Yahweh is placed on top of something else, but will never accredit the true foundation. Christ is not the foundation. He is the superstructure. Given the current conditions facing the West, a radical change and complete inversion of priorities is needed. The redemption of the guilty murderer? Is this story appropriate for our current era? We pagans understand that we are the minority, and therefore the junior partner. We understand that we are in the frustrating position that we will have to wait and abide by what the Christians wish to do, and in the manner and style which they wish to perform it. Ultimately, should the Christians win against progressivism, they give no credit and no space to us. Pagans need to do their homework and do a much better job of conversion. This much I agree with. Many people in our spheres are recent converts or recent reconverts to religion. I take their conversion as genuine if they are doing the reading and developing themselves spiritually in accordance with their chosen religious path, and ultimately formalizing it. I feel that the West will be placed in the unenviable position of having to choose between its survival or the survival of its people and the jettisoning of its dominant spiritual system. This, due to Yahweh's commandments, would not allow for a scenario in which Christianity was the junior partner, and would result in, not as Nietzsche said, the death of God, but in the total obliteration of Yahweh and his church. This is the ultimate price of fundamentalist zealotry. It largely has already happened in Europe. Assuming Europe isn't conquered by Islam in the next century, I think that Northern Europeans, especially in the formerly Protestant areas, will return to the old ways. The idea that there can only be one truth, one story in a society, comes from you. The progressives inherited it from you, and that attitude is most clear in the commandments. The evangelizing energy, frenetic and sometimes seemingly going to no purpose, is another inheritance. Illegitimate, warped, and twisted bastard child it may be, progressivism is still your child. And like an unloved, unwanted child, it will despise its parent all the more because of its similarity in form and behavior to its parent. To solve the commandment problem, there are options. One is having a religion inside a religion, similar to the Adeptus Mechanicus relationship with the imperial cult in Warhammer 40k, or how the Zoroastrians operate within Islamic society in Iran. The second, and easiest option, will likely be some form of basic religious toleration, which is already legally enshrined and is the reality on the ground since we live in a pluralistic society. As long as the norms of religious toleration, which have existed in the West for several hundred years, are applied, pagans are absolutely correct to expect the ability to exist. They can expect to not be persecuted and will have to extend the same courtesy to Christians. They are also correct in expecting recognition as a real religion. Any synthesis which occurs under that second scenario will be organic, occurring as a matter of course. But the sticking point obviously will come when implementing which elements of both paganism and Christianity, which synthesis of vision gets greater social and political control. Of course, there are those who favor a solution more like the Orange Catholic Bible. So, my fellow country bumpkins, how shall we proceed? In terms of coalition building, there is a key weakness that Christians have which pagans can address. How on earth are those who bear the sign of the cross going to talk to the Harry Potter women to get them to stop backing the regime? They will get very skittish if you try to implement policy they don't like. Answer? You get somebody like me to do it for you. I will gladly take on that duty and responsibility. They do have a victim complex, which I believe I can break them out of if you frame things in terms of what I've said of geopolitics. Core Pagan Criticism 5. Christianity is mean. They are divisive. We want to look out for all European peoples, but Christians just want to exclude pagans from moral consideration. Really, Christians need to acknowledge that we are all equal, that even though we might worship different gods, we are spiritually European and our beliefs have equal value. After all, paganism and Christianity are probably just two sides of the same coin. I've already addressed much of this, so I won't belabor the point. I will attempt to explain what I believe, however it is difficult to put things into words. I am still a layperson who's only begun my journey back to spirituality, but as far as I'm aware, no pagan profession of belief such as the Nicene Creed exists. So there is no concise statement which I could give that would suffice for that purpose. Please understand that this explanation might seem fragmentary due to the nature of Reconstruction. Furthermore, there is a problem which de Benoit writes about, which is unique to Abrahamic religions and especially Christianity. We've touched on it a little in the earlier sections. This problem is the necessity of belief, the necessity to require everyone to have the same belief. The demand for explanation of belief seems to me to be a demand for ant smell, which many pagans probably don't like, since they find it difficult to put into words. Dave is absolutely correct in asking for us to show him rather than tell him. This is a crucial difference, and that is to say that Christians find transcendence through the word, and pagans find it through image and deed. One cannot understand anything about this conflict until this is understood. This is why you will find that some pagans think that Christianity is a source of modern totalitarianism, why pagan critiques sound like new atheism in a Viking helmet. It is fascinating, however, to hear other thinkers such as William Gailey Simpson in Which Way Western Man preemptively echo those criticisms. It makes me wonder whether all left-wing social criticisms ultimately were noticed first by right-wing thinkers. But that is a discussion for another time. Christianity is an Abrahamic religion, so it is a religion of the word. Paganism is a religion which prioritizes the image and the deed as a means of finding transcendence. This is an interesting as a distinction and a difference, but I think it's more interesting how this could be used to create the next political order. The next order will be one which prioritizes the image and deed and the spectacle as its chosen aesthetic form, but which does not neglect the word. Such an order would indeed be quite formidable, one could say almost tailor-made to the conditions of smartphone TikTok modernity. Okay, what do I personally believe? Let's start at the beginning, the very story of creation itself. And I have a hyperlink to the Nordic creation story there as told by Tom Rousel. I believe in the eternal return, that never-ending cycle of being and becoming which is life eternal. I believe that the gods do not just operate in, but also occupy the world rather than being slightly separated from it. I believe in many gods, and they are known to me by the names that come to us through the Nordic and Germanic language, although I am willing to accept that they are the same gods in Greco-Roman tradition and even Hindu tradition to some extent. I believe that as all areas of the cosmos are connected on the world tree, so all things must be connected. I believe that when I have invoked the name of the gods for help, that they have responded. I have offered libations to the All-Father, and he has shown himself to me. I have seen the procession of gods in the night sky. Reconstruction of genuine forms of paganism is absolutely possible. Why? Reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European language based on historical comparison of other languages and familial shifts within family language families to know what the original vocabulary was. We have many forms of historical paganism. We have modern Hinduism, the last remaining polytheistic faith which is derived from the Pie spirit. Using the technique I described above regarding language, it will be much easier to reconstruct what Evola would describe as a genuine form of spiritual awakening. We have much more evidence in that regard than what the linguists used to reconstruct the Pie language, a dead tongue which was never written down and has not been spoken aloud for thousands of years. Using Germanic, Roman, and Hellenic sources alone, we can rebuild what glory has been lost to time. Any gaps in ritual understanding or ritual practices we don't fully comprehend, we can look to Hinduism to complete the picture of our puzzle. As to the ritual of human sacrifice, I cannot recommend that anyone partake in actions which would be considered legal under the current paradigm. Ritually butchering an animal for the sustenance of the group is an anthropologically attested pagan practice. For man must understand his place in nature as an apex predator, but also as a steward of the land. I believe that there is a reason why the areas of Northern Europe converted to Protestantism and fought against the Catholics during the Reformation. And that reason is because they were converted last and for the least amount of time. So in my view, they were indeed protesting the church. They were indeed rebelling against the only accepted church at the time. So yes, it was recognized as a rebellion against God. But the Catholic Church at the period was already a synthesis between the Hellenic and the Judaic world, and it rejected that synthesis in order to achieve greater authenticity and greater compliance with Scripture. but this is 500-year-old history at this point. There is no longer a priestly caste which can utilize a specialized language that is only taught through credentialing institutions which can gatekeep a sole interpretation of the words of Christ. Is it any wonder that the peoples of Northern Europe and their descendants are the least religious people in the world at this point in time? Could there be a spiritual reason why so many feel that they are not living in a way which is in accord with their true nature? I submit it does have a spiritual cause, and that cause is that Christianity is not the authentic spiritual form capable of satisfying them. Certainly, I see a necessity for worship in nature and of nature. Paganism of both Germanic and Hellenic varieties offers this through ritual. This is one way that we could diffuse the political conflict in the West, by satisfying needs in a manner which is pre-political. Again, how will Christ help us to address the environmentalist movement? In the US, it is somewhat different. We are still very Christian, and will likely remain so for some time. Although, retreating to Catholicism or Orthodox Christianity because it is the based Christian church will in the long term prove futile if I am correct about the relationship between Christianity and progressivism. They will only offer temporary safe harbor. So, as far as first contact goes, I am more than happy to continue this conversation. This is a good start. Perhaps a stream sometime. There are many more things to say, and the education which informs that dialogue hasn't been completed yet on either side. This will be a slow process. I deliberately am not answering each and every single question in the most minute detail that Dave posed for this very reason, and also in the interest of putting out a semi-timely reply. Anyhow, Yahweh can cope, seethe, and dilate that all the other gods are just as cool as him, and that he does not yet rule over the minds of all humanity as King of Kings.